Let us look at how microorganisms adapted to the cold. The ability to resist freezing and to restore activity after thawing is the one thing the microorganisms had adapted. The other one is ability to metabolize below the freezing point. Then the presence of specific intercellular components, metabolic antifreeze, stable and flexible membranes. We will study about antifreeze protein in the later part. The microbial respiration and continuous photosynthesis of CO2 fixation below minus 10 degrees centigrade. Psychrophilic, that is cold loving organisms, are also zero tolerant, adapted to extreme dry environments, and they also have a strong pigmentation, that is melanin, melanoids or carotenoids. So these are some of the adaptation by the microorganisms in the cold to survive in the Arctic winters. So here we will look at two major species. One is the lichens and the other organisms. Lichens with high desiccation tolerance is the one we will look at first. What is their water loss capacity? If we look at, they can survive water loss of more than 95% because lichens actually live in the land. Even the Arctic winter is extremely cold. There is no water there. So if they have to survive, then they have to live without water. So many of the species have adapted to water loss of more than 95%. And what do they do during the water loss? The thallus becomes inactive. That means metabolically they become dormant so that they can still survive. Then how do they tolerate a drought? They were able to withstand prolonged period of drought, and they have respiratory loss and heat stress. How do they tolerate this one? They inactivate. When the thallus becomes inactive, it prevents heat-induced respiratory loss and heat stress. So that is how they survive the cold winters. And how do they recover after water rehydrations? They can quickly reactivate metabolism upon rehydration. And what are their ecological role? They can inhibit extreme environment with fluctuating moisture. They actually help other plants survive. And when we look at other organisms, that is non-desiccation tolerant, when there is loss of water, what do? Typically, they cannot survive at high water loss. They simply die. And what is the state they do during the water loss? They continue the normal metabolic activity until death or stress. So this is the problems with the other species except lichens. And these other organisms are vulnerable to dehydration and cannot endure long dry periods. They are also susceptible to heat stress and respiratory loss due to active metabolism because they do not stop the metabolism, whereas lichen can stop their metabolisms. And the other organisms often require longer period of rehydration to recover, and they are usually found in more stable moist environment. So this is how lichens survive very effectively in the Arctic winter, whereas other species cannot. And what is the role of UVB radiation on microbes? The microbes produce some of the following compounds to reduce the UVB radiation penetrating into the thallus. They produce pyretin, usnic acid and atanorin. The structure of the compounds are given here. These compounds help these microbes survive UVB radiation. The carotenoids basically protect algae, fungi and lichens from excessive photosynthetically active radiation. So that is how they survive in the Arctic. Lichens trimline effect. So what is lichen trimline effect? Basically, there are certain areas where lichens are present and lichens are not present. So there is a boundary between these two species. So that is what is called the lichen trimline. So there are hollow depressions or small valleys which do not have lichens. Why they do not have lichens? Because the snow recedes from these areas only for a very brief period each season, or the snow persists there for several years. So here is the white color patch or the snow covered areas, and nearby we can see there is a small boundary, and this boundary says the areas in which lichens were actually present and the rest of the areas there is no lichen. So this boundary is called the lichen trimline effect. So there is a sharp delineation on rocks between zones with and without lichen. That is what is called the trimline effect, lichen trimline effect. See, this is in the Arctic is a observable boundary or gradient where environmental conditions, particularly temperature and moisture, determine the presence or absence of lichen growth. So we had seen lichen can survive with 95% loss of water also. So that means when there is snow, they can still survive for some time. So that is the reason near the snow also we have lichens which are present. So let us look at some of the factors which affect the lichen trimline effect. The first one is temperature sensitivity. In the Arctic and subarctic region, lichens are highly sensitive to temperature changes. As temperature increases due to climate change, this trimline, that is the boundary of lichen distribution, shifts more often towards the higher latitude or higher elevations. And when we talk about moisture and nutrient availability, lichens are also affected by the availability of moisture and nutrients. Areas with low moisture availability or harsher condition might have more defined trimline when lichen growth halts or is reduced, while more favorable conditions allow for increased lichen growth. That means nutrients are available, they grow. If nutrients are not available, they don't grow. So that is how we can see the clear difference of the trim line. And what is the climate change impact on this trim line? As the Arctic warms, the boundary of lichen growth may shift. So the trim line can be seen as a sign of changing climate conditions, with certain lichen species expanding their range in response to warmer and wetter conditions, while others may retreat as conditions become more extreme for their survival. So climate change can easily be seen when we look at the lichen's growth. Similarly, vegetation and habitat alterations, that is the presence or absence of lichen in this trimline zone, are indicative of broader ecological changes that is happening. Say for example, shifts in the lichen distribution can affect the broader Arctic systems because lichens are important for soil formation. They provide food for herbivores like reindeer, and they play a key role in the carbon and nutrient cycles. So when the lichens are present or not present completely affects the entire ecosystem. So let us look at some of the challenges related to monitoring lakes or rivers for biodiversity in the Arctic region. The first one is a few countries have an extensive spatial coverage, for example Finland and Sweden. If you look at here, Finland and Sweden, many things are given in blue color. So what does this blue means? They are routinely monitored with enough funding and good spatial coverage. So that means various monitoring lakes for FECs, the focal ecosystem components, are monitored. So there are various fish, and we have seen 6 key factors in the Arctic freshwater biodiversity. So all those things are being monitored both in Sweden and Finland. But rest of the countries, for example United States, they are not monitored continuously. In Canada, maybe in one area, one FEC is being monitored, but rest of the things are not monitored. And when we look at Russian Federation, most of the places it is not consistent. So instruments such as European Water Framework Directive promote routine monitoring of the lakes and rivers of FECs, but where a country, ecoregion or FEC is not covered by such instruments, monitoring becomes irregular and there is a poor spatial coverage or is not absent. In other words, when there is poor monitoring system, we are unable to understand what are the changes that are actually happening. So this is the real challenge. We are unable to completely study the change in the Arctic ecosystem because we are not monitoring the entire Arctic region. Let us look at the changes related to lakes and rivers for biodiversity. So the previous one we had seen the monitoring, whether it is being monitored or not. Now we will look at the change in biodiversity. So the vast area of Arctic region, that is high monetary cost, logistical constraints associated with the sampling, limits the possibility of routine continuous monitoring. Similarly, this leads to sparse sample coverage in space and time, particularly where funds are not available. Also, in countries where routine government monitoring is limited or does not occur, the data must come from academic research where unsecure funding often leads to single event sampling or incontinuous or inconsistent way of monitoring is happening. So the change over the time cannot be examined continuously, because for certain region we will monitor for maybe a year or two, but afterwards there is no monitoring in that region because there is no funding available for carrying out this research activity. So that means there is a discontinuity in monitoring. So these are some of the challenges which are being faced by scientific community to understand what changes are happening in the Arctic region. Let us look at the various impacts of climate change on the Arctic freshwater ecosystems. We have two major things. One is caused by the human and another one is change of climate. So let us look at these two things separately. So what are the nature or the impact that is being happening? The change in concentration of dissolved organic matters, minerals and nutrients, because when we talk about freshwater, they have nutrients. So the increased concentration are due to higher temperature, increased precipitation and runoff from thawing permafrost. So runoff from the thawing permafrost is one of the region there is increase in the nutrients in the Arctic freshwater ecosystems. And what are the impact from the human population growth? Because the increased concentration from land development, agricultural runoff, which is where manures, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. contains nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients which are being run off into Arctic freshwater ecosystems, and also the waste discharge which are reaching the Arctic region, due to which there is an increase in the nutrient level. And the light penetration in the lakes, there is a decreased light penetration in the lake due to increased dissolved organic matter and sedimentation. So this is the climate change. When we talk about the impact of the human, this is very similar to the impacts from construction and human activities, that is sedimentation from land development. Lots of sediment and other things reach the Arctic freshwater ecosystem. So when there are more sediments, they reduce the light penetration in the lakes. So how the nutrients are enriched? Increased in nutrient loading, that means nitrogen and phosphorus in freshwater ecosystem leading to eutrophication. This is what happens because of the warmer and wetter climate. And the human also does the same thing. Pollution from mining, oil and gas extraction, all these things put lot of nutrients into the Arctic water systems. And what is the change occurring in the sedimentation? The increased sedimentation is due to the result of thawing permafrost and changes in land use. And when we look at the human activities, the increased sedimentation comes from construction, land clearing and infrastructure projects. And how does this affect the biodiversity and the species composition? The warmer climate leads to potential decrease in the biodiversity because there is a change in temperature and nutrient availability which shifts the species composition. When we look at the human impact, the biodiversity is altered due to habitat disruption, pollution and the introduction of non-native species. And what happens to the species biomass due to warmer and wetter climate? There is a change in biomass because the species are now tending to adapt to nutrient regimes which are currently available and the temperature conditions. This leads to loss of Arctic species because they are not tolerant to the change of nutrients or change of temperature. So that leads to biomass loss. When we consider the human impact, there is a decreased biomass due to habitat destruction and pollution from human activities. This affects the Arctic ecosystem directly. And what is the change in the climatic zones? The Arctic zones are shifting towards north, reducing the spatial extent of the Arctic region. That means subarctic, low Arctic and the high Arctic regions are moving towards north. And how the humans affect it? The changes in vegetation and temperature regimes as human infrastructure and resource extraction influence the local climate drastically. And what is the effect on the ecosystem process? So the overall what we can say is warmer and wetter climates leads to altered ecosystem. That means change in nutrients and predatory prey dynamics, etc. These are due to changes in temperature, light and nutrient levels. Similarly, when we look at the human population growth, that leads to accelerated degradation of ecosystem functions due to human-induced disturbances, habitat fragmentation and pollution. So we have to be very careful. If we want to retain or sustain the Arctic ecosystem, then we have to carefully work in the Arctic region.